As people discussed the Beijing military parade, other highlights went unnoticed. The main image of the day is Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un together at the Beijing parade. Off camera, there was a bilateral meeting between Putin and Kim Jong-un, after which, for example, Reuters published a headline. Kim Jong-un promised to help Russia with everything he can, and Putin thanked the Democratic People's Republic of Korea for its assistance in the war against Ukraine. And this is not just another exchange of handshakes, it's not just a photo op, it's a public formalization of an axis with a direct military component. If there is anything I can or should do for you and the Russian people, I consider it my duty as a brotherly obligation. This is a quote from Kim Jong-un to Putin, saying he's ready to help with everything he can. Putin responds by saying, the relationship between our countries has acquired a special, trusting, friendly and allied character. Your servicemen fought bravely and heroically. We will never forget the sacrifices of your armed forces and the families of your servicemen. And separately, Putin praised the Democratic People's Republic of Korea special units that assisted Russian troops and participated in operations in the Kursk direction. But notice, with all Putin and Kim Jong-un's statements, Xi Jinping seems to be overlooked. Although it is Xi Jinping who actually leads this triangle, the axis of evil, which is now opposing the West. So let's discuss this new axis in detail. Pyongyang, Moscow, and where does Beijing fit in here? Because Beijing still plays the main role here, but it seems to be stepping into the shadows. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is September 4th. Before we begin, I want to note that every day on this YouTube channel, there are fresh news and analytical stories, so that you stay up to date with absolutely everything. That's why I recommend subscribing to this YouTube channel. Hit the like button and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link is in this video's description. So, to understand the whole picture, it's worth paying attention to what Xi Jinping is no longer hiding. How exactly China is involved in helping North Korea and Russia in the war against Ukraine. First of all, a joint photo with Xi Jinping is a kind of bonus propaganda for Kim Jong-un and Putin. China is no longer hiding this axis, it is showing it publicly. Secondly, Moscow is officially legitimizing North Korean infantry and shells as part of its military machine. Previously, the Kremlin preferred not to say this out loud, but now it has. And by the way, this also changes the legal landscape. This opens a window for imposing sanctions at the United Nations level. And the practice of intercepting cargo, maritime routes, insurance, inspections, and so on. Thirdly, this is another blow to the claim that Russia is not internationally isolated. And Beijing is holding a parade. There stands a trio, and one of them publicly promises to help the warring side with everything he can. The puzzle has come together. Well, now it's clear that North Korea and Russia are not waging war against Ukraine on their own. Xi Jinping is showing that he himself is conducting this orchestra. What does this mean for the front lines and the rear? Last year, Reuters gave a detailed account of how North Korea's ammunition bridge closed a critical gap in Russian artillery. Now, people have been added along with equipment. These are special units, the so-called North Korean volunteers and instructors for multiple launch rocket system and drones. The logic is simple. The longer North Korea's supply line is for the Kremlin, the longer they can hold the front line without major problems. And on the other hand, the tougher the West squeezes this logistics of arms supplies from North Korea to Russia, well, the fewer opportunities Moscow has. And now, on top of this axis comes the European hunt for Russia's shadow fleet and the new price cap on Russian oil. If Moscow was counting on covering the budget deficit with cheap logistics for oil and coal, then in 2025 this turns into a rather expensive game. Insurance is getting more expensive, ports are closing, and major repairs for shadow fleet vessels are no longer done in the European Union and Britain. This axis is getting energy, political blows, and not just political ones. This is very important. Nevertheless, Beijing is playing the smartest game in this situation. Formally, look, pay attention. Formally, China doesn't make any commitments, like for Russia or for North Korea. But in fact, Xi Jinping has given both dictators, Kim Jong-un and Putin, a platform for self-assertion. For the Chinese audience, this image supposedly shows China at the top of the triangle. For the external audience, it's a message that China is the arbiter in its sphere of influence, that China is taking control of all of Asia and the entire global south. And here it's the boss. At the same time, China, notice this, avoids any specific statements in support of the war and publicly repeats the mantra about stability, free trade, and a world without bloc logic. It's double talk, of course, but this double talk works. China gets cheap energy resources from Russia, technological barter and leverage against the West without risking direct sanctions like the ones Iran or Russia, for example, have faced. Well, if anything, all the blows fall on North Korea and Russia while Xi Jinping remains unpunished. But again, it's already obvious that it's China that's actually leading this whole alliance. Now, how are the United States of America responding to all of this? Well, publicly it seems like they're not panicking, but they're acting tough. Why? It just seems that way. The West can't attack China directly, so they're targeting intermediaries. The United States and its allies are increasing coordination to stop the supply of weapons from North Korea to Russia and are considering expanding sanctions against companies and ports involved in this logistics. That's what Western media are reporting. If you look at all this logically, then without Western insurance and without access to ports, this access turns into a series of rather risky trips that are either delayed or become very, very expensive. But do you see China in this pressure? No. Even though Xi Jinping has publicly shown that he essentially leads both North Korea and Russia, he himself remains out of harm's way, since officially he hasn't given any public signals or openly supplied weapons to Russia. It's much easier to do all this through North Korea. After all, it's already been an outcast for a long time. Even if the West starts hunting down any ships transporting weapons from North Korea to Russia, or targets some kind of railway logistics, hits them with sanctions and so on, they'll be hitting both Russia and North Korea. China is excluded. Where is Ukraine? At the center of everything. Kim Jong-un's promise to help with everything he can isn't just a declaration. It's about shells, multiple launch rocket system drones, and people. So, for Kyiv, there are three practical conclusions from this situation. First, speeding up deliveries from allies, air defense and missile defense systems, electronic warfare in the east and south. Put simply, a denser sky makes North Korean reinforcement attempts more costly for the Kremlin. Second, deep strikes on Russian Federation rear logistics are crucial. If you cut these bridges through ports, crossings, warehouses and so on, the axis becomes more theatrical than effective. Supplies from the People's Republic of China will simply get stuck somewhere on the territory of Russia. Third, it's diplomacy. Well, for example, European capitals can now easily explain to their voters why a military mission inside Ukraine is not a whim. It's Europe's insurance against the export of this new Chinese axis. Second, European capitals to their voters, the Chinese mission. Yesterday was uncertain. Today, everything is clear and public. Xi Jinping brought these two dictators to the podium, stood them next to him, and said, "We are together." And here I'll include a long quote, just so you know, to remember that propagandists will be spinning it now. Kim Jong-un says to Putin, "If there is anything I can or should do for you and the Russian people, I consider it my duty, like a brotherly obligation." And Putin's response, "Your soldiers fought bravely and heroically. We will never forget their sacrifices." You know, this is no longer just conditional sympathy, it's a promise and gratitude for participating in the war. And this is what Moscow and Pyongyang need to be held accountable for legally, through the United Republics Organization's sanction regime and practically through ports, insurance, freight and inspections. And let me remind you, Xi Jinping himself was shouting that sanctions should go through the United Nations. Well, here's a case for you. Two dictators admit that they are waging war against Ukraine, bypassing United Nations rules. So, if China is being honest, it should support United Nations, level sanctions against both Russia and North Korea. But it won't do that. That's why the masks are off and it's time to hit China. That's the main player in this alliance. Again, those public statements by Putin and Kim Jong-un saying, "You helped us, thank you." Kim Jong-un says, "If needed, I'll help again." This is all theatrics to show Xi Jinping isn't part of the alliance and that they're making their own deals. That's why Beijing gave the world a rare, honest glimpse in politics. The dictators are side by side. War isn't just an abstraction, it's a joint project. It's not only Russia versus Ukraine, it's a project of the trio. And now this axis is no longer shy about its wording. The good news is that this axis has weak points. It's logistics and money. Is that why the European decision is to crack down on and dismantle Russia's shadow fleet to lower the price cap on Russian oil? And, to concentrate all security guarantees inside Ukraine? That's where it ends up, where the core issue isn't ideology, but money. And if Paris pushes through these security guarantees, then the footage from Beijing will remain beautiful, but expensive. And very expensive at that. And that's what we need to focus our attention on. So for now, I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to this YouTube channel and don't forget to like it. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.